Let's come back to the reactivity I was talking about earlier. Until now we had rather simple examples. We clicked a button, we changed one property. We kind of touched on that if we wanted to output some text depending on another property. Remember that counter where I said greater than 10 and smaller than 10? Well, I kind of rebuilt the example here. This time I'm not outputting the text, or I'm not outputting this code here where I check if it is greater than 5 here in my template in the string interpolation, though I could do that, but I outsourced it here. This leads to the following behavior. If I click here, we see smaller than 5 at the beginning, but once we go over 5, it changes to greater than 5 or greater 5. That is nice, and that is easy to maintain for this simple application. Now imagine this counter variable would be used in a lot of different places. A lot of other properties would depend on this counter here. It could quickly get problematic to manage them all in this increase function. Or think you would have another place where you set this counter. Then you would need to keep both in sync, and well, that is really hard to maintain. It would already get harder to maintain if I were to add the decrease button here, execute the decrease method, and simply duplicate the increase method here to now also have the decrease method. And I do the same check as before again. So here I can now go over 5 and then back to smaller. This works, but you notice that I have this code in 2 places. And if I would have other sources of setting this counter, it would quickly get unmaintainable. Thankfully, Vue.js makes it much easier than that to model such cross-property dependencies. I'll get rid of both the functions here. I'll get rid of the whole methods object, and I'll rewrite the code to simply increase the counter here and decrease it here. Now, how do I update my result now? I can't set the logic here. Data is not reactive, so I can't say this counter greater 5 and then execute my code here. This will not work. That is not how the data property works. But turns out we do have a way to still do that. The first one would be one we already saw in action. If I reintroduce my methods, I could add a result method here, and all I could do here would be I can simply return this statement from before, where I simply check if this counter is greater than 5, in which case I could say greater 5, and otherwise say smaller than 5, whatever text you want to output. I could then call result here, get rid of this result property, and upon re-rendering this, you would see it now works again. This is one way of doing it. Now we already improved this a lot, because now we don't have to worry about the different sources influencing our counter. It still has a disadvantage though. If I add a third button here, where I do something totally different, let's say I have my second counter, which I increment here. So increment or increase second, and then I'll add it here. If I have such a setup, this result method here will still get executed upon each updating of the page. Vue.js will update the page whenever it finds the need to do so, which will be whenever one of its data properties changes. We obviously, since we output them here, need to update the page. And it doesn't know if the result function we execute here does use one of the properties we changed. So it doesn't know if the change of second counter influences the result method, and therefore it re-executes this method as well. This might not be a problem for this rather lightweight function here, but imagine you have a function which takes longer to run, which runs more complicated code, and which you don't want to re-execute even though it is not needed to be re-executed. For this case, we got a new property on our global, on our Vue instance here. It's called computed, and it also takes a JavaScript object, just like data and methods. The computed property or object here also allows us to store properties, for example, output to not reuse result. But here it is not directly the data. Instead, this also is a function where we return the value this property here should eventually have. So I can copy the code from down there. It looks the same as this result method here, which as a side note, I just realized I wrote as a ES6 function. This would be the ES5 syntax. Both works as you see, just a little spoiler, I wanted to show this later. But anyways, this is the code which will run in every browser, the other will not, sorry about that. Back to the output though, that's the interesting part. It looks like the result method here, it just has a different name. But actually we use it differently. I can output both here, let's say. So I'll use string interpolation again, and I'll use output like this. Notice the difference? No parentheses. I don't call it as a function. I use it like a property stored in my data object. It isn't stored there, but I can use it in just the same way. And that's important to keep in mind. Everything stored in computed can be used just like you use a property in the data object. The interesting thing about it is, for this, if I save that, we see smaller than 5 twice and we see that both updates just fine. The difference behind the scenes is the result function gets called every time because Vue.js doesn't know if it needs to rerun this. It doesn't know if we use any property in this function which was changed. For computed properties, it does analyze the code and it is aware of this. So for a computed property, it is aware that output is not interested in the second counter at all and thus will not be run if I hit the increase second button. And I can prove this to you. Let's simply add a console log where I will say computed here in the case of my computed function. And for the normal method here, I will say method. With that set up, and I just realized this should be second counter here, of course. With that corrected, I can go to my counter and simply output my second counter here as well. And if I now hit Control Enter and open up my console, watch what happens. I'm going to hit increase first. We see method and computed. So both get executed here, which makes sense because I changed my counter and my output, my computed property here, depends on this counter. So it makes sense that it gets recalculated because, again, it depends on it. The result method gets executed anyways, as I explained, and I can prove this. Watch what happens if I hit increase second. Keep in mind, this only increases the second counter, something which is not used in my computed output property here. Thus, if I hit it, we only see method being added. Computed is not getting executed. So this function here is not getting executed at all. Only this function, because again, it gets executed all the time because Vue.js is not aware of what's inside of it. It is of my computed property here though, which is why we don't see computed when clicking increase second. This is how we can use and how we should use computed properties if we get dependencies like this. It is the best way to do it because we're caching the result. We're not unnecessarily recalculating it if there is no need to recalculate. So only use this function way here if you know that you don't want to cache the result, that you want to recalculate every time the DOM gets updated, because for some reason you know that this is required even though you might update a property which is not used in this function you're calling here at all. There might be such cases, but most of the time it probably isn't the case, so make sure to really take advantage of this great concept of computed properties here.